For as long as I can remember, I've been telling stories that aren't quite true. On resumes and in job interviews, I've bent the details of my life story towards what someone else wants to hear. Not about this job, but others. In conversations at parties, I've edited and curated my life story in ways that smooth some of the rough edges. When I'm in an argument with someone, whether that's in real life or just in my own head, the facts of the story I'm telling are often strongly biased in my direction. I know how to craft a version of the story where my peccadillos are minimized and the evil deeds of the other person are vastly exaggerated. I know how to steer a story away from trouble spots, away from my own grief and anger, away from the bits that might prove embarrassing or that might undercut some angle I'm trying to work. But maybe it's just me. Maybe none of you do these sorts of things. The Bible is full of good stories, artfully told. But someone or some community of someones was responsible for the crafting and the shaping of these stories. And I suppose they were a little bit like me, with axes to grind or causes to celebrate. So as we read today's story about David and Michal, I encourage you to struggle with what you hear, to wrestle with the story in its current form. I love it that we're still doing this, that we're still gathering and reading Scripture together. It's a very rabbinic, not to agree, but just to be able to argue about important things by listening to texts from Scripture. I love that we're doing this. I do believe these stories can be transformative, but those possibilities for transformation emerge, I think, when we stay attuned to our own experience, the own tension in us that sort of emerges as we listen. By living wisely with powerful stories, we can become more aware, I think, of the various stories that are shaping our lives, and we can also become a little bit better at deciding how best to tell our own stories. So I want to read today's story in 3 parts. So Jenna, this is crucial. Just stay on the part we're reading. Don't advance past it, because that would be cheating, right? So after each of these parts, we'll pause for just a moment to reflect on what you're experiencing, right, as we move through the story. Okay, so part 1. This is from 2 Samuel 6. Listen for God's voice to you in part 1 of 3 from our reading today. So David went and brought God's chest, the Ark of the Covenant, brought God's chest up from Obed-Edom's house to David's city with celebration. Whenever those bearing the chest advanced 6 steps, David sacrificed an ox and a fatling calf. David, dressed in a linen priestly vest, danced with all his strength before the Lord. This is how David and the entire house of Israel brought up the Lord's chest, the ark, with shouts and trumpet blasts. Okay, pause. What's happening in the story? What's getting your attention? What expectations are already in place? So where do you think this thing's going? Well, maybe some of you have read this story enough to know where it's going, but maybe this is kind of a first time for you. I didn't say anything about who Obed-Edom is or what's going on. But let me hear from you. This is not rhetorical. Shout out. What'd you notice? What got your attention from this first little chunk of the story? Too much slaughter. Every 6 steps, animals were getting slaughtered. That's a lot, yeah. A diva procession. David the diva. Dancing. Music. Whole house of Israel. It's a big party. It's a big deal. Ritual. David had no or very little clothes on. So someone knows where this story is going. Okay, back here, and I think I missed what you said. A waste of food. So yeah, lots of waste in this party. John. What's in the chest? Yes, this is a sacred object for Israel, right? I think the tablets, this is a glowing chest. It killed someone just a few pages earlier in this story because they dared to touch it, right? Good. This story is the white-hot center of the Hebrew Bible. It is this story right here that we just started reading of David, king of Israel, that will supply the early followers of Jesus with the primary framework for understanding Jesus' life and significance. This is the kind of story they will tell about Jesus. David is a king who unifies the north and the south. For Israel, he settles them in territory. He develops a military capable of defending their borders, securing trade routes. And now David establishes a capital city. It gets his name. Jerusalem's called David's city. And that city will serve as a combined political and religious center for all of Israel. And now here comes this captivating king who shows his leadership skills by bringing Israel's most powerful traditional symbol. This is an old thing, the ark. It's been traveling in the wilderness with Israel. It brings this old symbol into a brand new political universe. This is politics at its highest pitch. David himself has undergone significant development, from an overlooked little brother in an agricultural family to a teenager brave enough to swagger out and take on Goliath, to an uncanny military leader, and now into his final role as the king who consolidates his people's motley past into a settled and secure identity in their own land. Lots of changes for David, but lots of changes for Israel too. No longer are they a wandering people, some loose confederation of tribes. Israel has become a military power, an economic player, a people settled in their own land with its own capital city. Israel's life is no longer simple. It has become complex and bureaucratic. So we might want to read this story. We've only read part one, but one way to read it might be as guidance for how to register, how to frame all the change and development that happens across a lifetime as things get more complex. Ready for part two? Let's keep going. All right, Jenna. So part two from 2 Samuel 6. As the Lord's chest, the ark, entered David's city, Saul's daughter, Michal, was watching from a window. Interesting. She saw King David jumping and dancing before the Lord, and she lost all respect for him. What's going on now? The Lord's chest was brought in and put in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. No temple yet. Solomon will do that. Then David offered entirely burned offerings in the Lord's presence, in addition to well-being sacrifices, more slaughter, more blood. Kite, I know you love this. When David finished all this, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of heavenly forces. He distributed food among all the people of Israel to the whole crowd, male and female, each receiving a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake. Then all the people went back to their homes. Okay, end of part two. Now, what are you noticing from part two? What got your attention here? Descent. Michal's descent. Good word. What else? At least they ate all the slaughterings. It was a barbecue, right? What else? They make a point to point out that male and female. Very inclusive. So all right. We're in Jerusalem, but like the whole nation is now here. Nobody left out. Everybody gets a dispersal of food from the party. They had homes to go back to, no longer a nomadic tribe. So right, you had the sense of a settled people in a place. Anything else? Like a food pantry, they had food to take home. That's right. Again, a skilled politician at work. After an event that happens to buttress his power, everybody gets stuff. Brilliant. Buying acceptance? Maybe? buying acceptance. Alice, you're really cynical. I can't believe that. Idea of how a king should act. And Michal has a few things to say about this. She's called Saul's daughter. That's interesting. She is. So the band is playing this celebratory parade. Dancing David is right at the center of it all, and we get the sense he loves being at the center with everyone else singing and dancing around him. But Michal, one of his several wives, who happens to be the daughter of the king that David is replacing. This is pretty messy in terms of family systems, right? She's not part of this parade. She's at home, we're told, quote, watching from a window. What a great detail. There are lots of women named in the Bible. Of course, in Kristen's sermon from just a couple of weeks ago, she showed us a huge list that took several screens even to fit them all. Hundreds of women who appear in the Bible. Michal is one of them. But there's a theologian named Lynn Marie Tonsad points out how women might get a few pages, but they never get to carry the big stories like the men do. This is how she puts it, quote, there's no story of a woman in the Bible nearly as complex as the stories of Abraham, Jacob, David, or even as complex as the story of Absalom. Representationally, biblical women are mostly stereotypical, reduced to one characteristic or desire. To the extent that we seek biblical models for understanding and patterning our own lives and behavior, and to the extent that gender is part of that search, the Bible doesn't offer many options for many different sorts of women, end quote. Ouch. True, I think. So what does that mean? That means that what we're reading is David's story. This is David's story. Michal appears in the window, but she does so as a character in David's story. Earlier in this same story of David, we learned that young Michal fell head over heels in love with David when he served with her father, King Saul. And to win Michal as his wife, David agreed on a dangerous mission to go and kill 100 Philistines. Here's more slaughter for you, Kai. It gets worse. To prove that he killed them, he brings back their mutilated genitals. If you haven't read the Hebrew Bible in a while, you might want to go back. It's pretty gruesome. With such passionate beginnings in this love affair, one might wonder what on earth happened to this relationship between David and Michal. You might read the story, I guess, as another attempt to come to grips with what can go wrong in a marriage. Lots can, I suppose, over the years. How can two people fall in love and then come later to hate one another so much? I've never raised that particular question while officiating a wedding, but I probably should. But we also might give thanks to the editors of this story simply for not erasing Michal completely, for leaving her there at the window. Perhaps she could teach us how important it is to never fully believe the success stories we hear, never to fully believe the stories we tell about ourselves. You ready for part 3? Okay, Jenna, part 3, please. David went home to bless his household, but Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet him. How did Israel's king honor himself today? I'm not sure how to intone this, right? I mean, part of the fun of the story would just be like play around with different ways you could sound this out. By exposing himself in plain view of the female servants of his subjects, like any indecent person would. I think she was probably swearing, but this is kind of cleaned up a little bit. We're almost to the end of this story. Is this what you expected? Is this where you thought it was going? David replied to Michal, I was celebrating before the Lord, who chose me over your father and his entire family, and who appointed me leader over the Lord's people, over Israel, and I will celebrate before the Lord again. I may humiliate myself even more, and I may be humbled in my own eyes, but I'll be honored by the female servants you're talking about. Michal, Saul's daughter, had no children until the day she died. End of story. What are you noticing now? Did this story go where you thought it would? What did you notice in part 3 of the way this story unfolds? He cut her off. Absolutely. Or she cut him off. You beat me to the punch. I was going to raise the issue of how we read this final line. Michal, Saul's daughter, had no children until the day she died. On the one hand, right, it might be read as divine judgment, right? Barrenness is a theme, right, in the Hebrew Bible. So it sounds at first like God's judgment, but I almost want to wonder, maybe after all this, she didn't sleep with David anymore. Maybe she took control of her own story, right? Took responsibility for her own life. One ready to read the story. I missed something back here. Bill.
At the time, that was the ultimate insult.
Right.
So this is the way it finishes with a real insult. Not very pleasant.
It's not very pleasant to read. And we're left with considerable tension, right? About what's going on with David, right? So this is the success story, right? For Israel, for King David. Everything has come together, and yet right at the top of this success moment, such harsh denigration of Michal. That ought to leave us uneasy. The story resolves in this devastating dismissal of Michal. She's the monster and the villain in the story. On the one hand, it ends with, we don't know. Is it a curse on her? Does she take her responsibility for her own life? We're not sure how to read it. But now let me move back to us, right? This is a wonderfully provocative ancient story. What is it that we can receive from sort of hearing this story today? Well, I want to read this story today because all of us are fundamentally storytellers. We piece together narratives that frame our lives and our experience. We tell stories about our development and growth, stories about our family life, stories about our national life, stories about our congregational life. And as storytellers, we are partisans and ideologues. We are very complicated storytellers. We're biased to tell it in particular ways, to avoid certain parts of the story that don't serve our agendas. But maybe with Michal's help, we can come to grips with this tendency to bend our stories so that we can become less dangerous, less wedded to our own stories, more willing to disassemble them, take them apart, and so that we can try them out again. I think Michal can help us become better storytellers. When we tell success stories that don't have a wise, dissenting Michal in the window, we get into trouble. So can I give you here at the end just a few short ideas? You will have better examples. You will think of other things from your own life and from our community life, but just to get you thinking about how we could get better at telling our stories. So one of our cherished progress stories is the growth of American cities, right? Just part of American culture. Population shifts from smaller and mid-sized places to urban areas have, for the most part, been cheered on as a form of cultural progress. We could celebrate an economy and a culture in which all young people are genuinely free to choose whether they want to live in a city or in a smaller place. That'd be a great thing. And you'd think that technology and trends in remote work would foster this kind of freedom where people get to live wherever they want. But that's not really how things have unfolded. I'm from a small place and have worked in small places. Some of you grew up in small places. You know this isn't quite true, right? So take as an extreme example the city of Manawi, Nebraska. Population 1. Have you seen this story? Elsie Eiler is the sole resident of Manawi, Nebraska. She wakes up every day, she walks along the empty main street to open its one remaining business, the Manawi Tavern, which her family has run since 1971. Now, there's only one person in this town, but there's about 2,000 people in the county, so they all come to the tavern. The town continues to exist only because Mrs. Eiler files the required county and state paperwork every year. On top of bartending and cooking, she's the town's mayor and tax collector, too. She does it all. A caricature, of course, an extreme example, of course. But our progress stories always have shadow sides, right? Take another example. Another of our cherished progress stories, the expansion of our highway system in 20th century America as we become a car culture. Yeah, it's a good thing in many ways. It's innovative in many ways, but the collateral damage is real to our places, to our quality of life. In the most recent federal infrastructure bill, there are billions marked for highway improvements. I guess that's a good thing, depending on how they get used. Some cities are planning to use that money to widen highways, existing highways that split neighborhoods in half and contribute to congestion and to further racial inequality. Here in Kansas City, we've got some issues. Some of our highway building has harmed black and brown neighborhoods and made parts of our city unwalkable. I made the unfortunate decision to bring this part of the sermon up with some architects and designers this morning. So it got me all turned around about my examples. Suffice it to say that I-670 beneath downtown and the highway between downtown and the city market are problematic, and there's various proposals, right, to try to remedy this problem. How did I do, designers, of avoiding a narrative that I had built that I had to change because you told me I was wrong? Anyway, whether you like these proposals for how to solve the sort of rendings of our downtown or not, it basically proves the point that bisecting urban neighborhoods with busy highways was not a great idea in the first place. One more example, okay? Just think about the progress myth of technology in general and social media in particular. Increasingly, we're all coming to grips with the shadow side of social media. While digital platforms enable us to find recipes and stay in touch with our grandkids, they also do a wonderful job of connecting extremist hate groups and facilitating domestic terrorism. Not everyone who uses social media winds up hateful, polarized, and dangerous, but some sure do. And the point of a new book by Max Fisher, I love the title, The Chaos Machine, the inside story of how social media rewired our minds and our world. The upshot of that book is that even if you don't become a racist or spread conspiracy theories or traffic children or join an insurrection, your life has probably still been distorted and deformed in important ways by social media. As one book review put it, quote, "The enjoyment of moral outrage is one of the key sentiments that Fisher, the author, sees being exploited by the algorithms devised by Google for YouTube and Meta for Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, which discovered they could monetize this impulse by having their algorithms promote hyper-partisanship. Divisiveness drives engagement, which in turn drives advertising revenue," end quote. It's a very simple business model. The point is to keep you upset. They make more money when you're upset. There's a shadow side to all of our progress stories. That's my point. Good stories, well-told stories, explore complexity. They tend to richness and the multidimensionality of the truth. They refuse to listen only to the winning side. Good stories include the underside, the vanquished, the group who lost. Stories of success or progress, if they're going to be good stories, will include the cost, the loss, the shadow, the neglected pieces. And in some versions of that success story, there's no room for the pain of imperfect beginnings. So perhaps all this can help us better understand our own stories, the way we tell our stories to others. Learning to tell a better story about ourselves would mean that we're learning to tell it richly, that we'd learn to include all the hard parts, the shameful bits, the undigested pieces. Friends, responding to God's love is not about polishing up our stories, purifying them of their complexity. I think being loved by God means exactly the opposite. Being loved by God means that we find the courage to embrace and honor and even cherish the cost, the losses, the shadow sides of our own development, our own stories. Don't get me wrong, Michal is defiantly Michal. I don't want to turn her into a symbol or a cipher. She is fully herself, and I don't want to dilute her force or personality. But she might also be a symbol, couldn't she, of good storytelling? Might she represent those defeated or erased or forgotten? Might she represent all that we ourselves have marginalized or discounted in the telling of our own official success stories? And if we can welcome Michal in her own story as well as in ours, might we learn to tell a better story about our world and about ourselves? Might we then be in a position to welcome God into the actual experience of our lives rather than asking God to stabilize and support some story we've concocted and crafted? What a relief it can be to drop the stressful act of performing and posing, settling into the complex and imperfect lives that God actually offers to us. Amen.